Shadow Hearts probably isn't one of the most famous RPGs, but over the years since its release, it has developed somewhat of a cult following, and indeed still has a special place in my heart. Hello, I'm Roy McCoy, and welcome to the latest episode of my series, What Happened To, where we take a game and/or series from history that has seemingly disappeared and ask those all-important questions: what was it, what happened to it, and will we ever see it again? Now, Shadow Hearts is the topic of this evening's video, and this game, this series, has been requested a number of times, most recently by Chad Henry, and I just want to say a big thanks to Chad and everyone else for encouraging me to make this video. And if you do have any other suggestions of other games you would like me to cover, please let me know in the comments below. And of course, if RPGs and story-driven experiences are your thing, please remember to give this video a like and subscribe because it really helps my channel grow. And after that shameless plug, let me take you on a journey back to the year 1997, and our story begins with this gentleman, Hiroki Kikuta, who had been previously employed as a composer at Square and had made the music for games such as Secret of Mana. However, Hiroki Kikuta seemingly wanted more, but felt that he couldn't realise his dreams and ambitions of making his own game while still at Square, with a number of articles from the time stating that the hierarchical system of Square led Hiroki Kikuta to feel that the only way he could make his own game was by founding his own company, which is exactly what he did in 1997 with a group of other Square employees and funding from SNK. And this is how the company called Saknoth came to be. And in 1999 in Japan they released the game Koudelka. Now, possibly if you're not familiar with the Shadow Hearts series, right now you're looking at the title and thinking, hang on a minute, I thought this was all about Shadow Hearts. Why is this game called Koudelka? Well, I'm getting to that. Now, when Hiroki Kikuta founded Saknoth, he became the CEO of the company and the first game's main creative lead. He took on the roles of producer, director, writer, and composer. He basically wanted to do everything, and apparently his initial ideas for this game was that it would be some kind of horror RPG. And if you're looking at the trailer for the game right now, you can see that this is an exceptionally dark and gothic feeling game, and it was set in Wales in a kind of haunted monastery. Now, an interesting thing to add here is that some of the character animations, the settings, and the overall feel of the game and puzzles led to the title being compared with early Resident Evil games. Now, from all reports, Kikuta had quite the revolutionary approach to this game, and he wanted to break away from a lot of those typical RPG conventions, and he didn't want a turn-based combat, he wanted something that was more real-time. However, the game ended up with a turn-based combat system, and ended up using a lot of the typical conventions that were seen in RPGs of the time. This led to Kikuta regretting his lack of direct control over the project. Something interesting to point out here is an unusual feature in that the game had English voice work for all of the characters, and when it was released in Japan, it used subtitles rather than a Japanese voice dub. So, what happened to it? Well, in 1999 the game was published in Japan by SNK and a year later by Infogrames. And while the game was received rather well in Japan and sold relatively well, it wasn't so much of a success story in the rest of the world. Now, some people have cited this as due to the fact that Infogrames did very little in the form of marketing the game, which is a distinct possibility. However, there were a number of parts of the game that the critics did not like, with the game mainly receiving between 6s and 7s, and the main areas of criticism being the slow pace of the game and the combat system. However, a lot of people praised the setting and the tone, which was that dark, gothic element, and also the story. Now, if I have to give my own opinion at this moment, I think there are a few factors that let it down. Number one, I think the name Koudelka wasn't exactly what we would call catchy. Now, I've cited this before as a problem. It seems that when JRPGs released their games with names that were appealing to the West, like Final Fantasy, or even survival horrors like Silent Hill, they did really well. But when they had an unusual name like Koudelka or Suikoden, they didn't seem to do as well as they should have done. Now, as you're well aware, Suikoden is undoubtedly one of my favourite series of all time, but I still to this day believe that if it was called The Stars of Destiny, that game would have sold much, much better. Now, I'm sure in the comments below you can let me know of exceptions to this rule where games with unusual titles have sold exceptionally well and gone on to be massive successes. But I don't think this was the major factor in the lack of success for this game. I think it was the problem that it didn't quite know what it wanted to be, whether it wanted to be a horror game or a typical RPG, and I think the game suffered for that. I also think that the real-time combat system would have made that game work even better. However, you cannot rewrite history. Now, one fallout from the lack of success in the West that this game had was that Hiroki Kikuta resigned as the CEO of his own company. However, Sacknoth decided not to give up. Which is interesting because I believe if this game had been made by Square, looking at their track record when it comes to sales with games like Sleeping Dogs and Vagrant Story, Square would give up at this point. However, Sacknoth decided to continue. And in 2001, in Japan, they released the first game with the title Shadow Hearts, with the American version coming out late that year and the European version coming out in 2002. Shadow Hearts wasn't exactly a direct sequel, neither was Koudelka a prequel to this game. However, it needs to be said that Shadow Hearts does maintain a number of references to events in Koudelka, along with some characters and elements returning from that first game. The story takes place 10 years after the events in Koudelka, in the year 1913 in a pre-World War I world. The story follows a character called Yuri, who is human but maintains the ability to capture and transform into monsters. How cool is that? Shadow Hearts maintained that gothic style, that gothic dark energy of the first game. And while it did have many elements of a typical RPG, it didn't have the fantasy setting that a lot of RPGs of the time used, instead incorporating real elements of history and an overall darker feel. The game was published in Japan by Aruze and by Midway, who are a company more famous for creating characters who impaled you with a huge chain and shouted, "Get over here!" Yes, these were the people who produced the Mortal Kombat games, which is why a number of people were surprised that Midway had produced an RPG. However, there were still some elements of criticism. Before we talk about the negatives, the positives were the story and the combat system, which I have to agree from memory is one of the most innovative elements of this game. It incorporated something called the Judgment Ring. This effectively was a huge circle in which the player had to use skill to hit the button at the right time to stop a pointer in a segment to launch a successful attack. Now, as I've said, at the time this was innovative, and a lot of the critics enjoyed the combat system. However, the same cannot be said for the graphics, which along with the gameplay balance was the major area of complaint by the critics, and it has led to the score on Metacritic currently standing at 73. So not a bad game, but not a great game, sadly. However, the best was yet to come, and in 2004 in Japan and North America, and in 2005 in Europe, published by Aruze Games in Japan, and once again by Midway in the rest of the world, came my personal favourite and probably the best game of the series and arguably one of the greatest games of its generation, Shadow Hearts Covenant. Once again, the game maintained that dark and gothic tone and took place in 1915 in an alternate reality. Now, I'm not one for ruining stories in these videos, but the game followed on from the bad ending of the previous game. Yes, there was a bad ending and a good ending. And this time, the main protagonists were Karen Koenig, a strong female lead, and once again, Yuri Hyuga was back. Now for me, this game feels like it managed to pull all of the elements from the previous game and make them bigger and better. And it felt much like a fresh start. And I think this was coupled with the fact that the developer had changed its name from Sacknoth to Nautilus. It had great graphics, it had a wonderful setting and tone, that dark, gothic element. It had references to the real world, but set in an alternate universe. The story was phenomenal. And of course, the combat mechanics, once again, there was that innovative style. It was a brilliant, well-made game. And the Metacritic score to this day backs that up. It stands at a whopping 85, with many of the critics of the time giving it 8s and 9s. This game was amazing. Now, this is a point that I'm going to mention something. At the time, I don't remember any of my friends or many other people that I knew playing this game or even knowing that this game existed. Now, apparently it sold somewhere between 120 and 150,000 copies in Japan and a similar number in North America. Which, while it was considered by Aruze as a relative success, it doesn't seem to have been an overwhelming success, which is such a shame for such a magnificent game and series. And this is possibly down to it being overshadowed by bigger and more famous RPG series of the time. Now, I've already stated that I believe that Covenant is the best game in the series, but I would say that all three of the games that I've mentioned so far were hits with me. I really enjoyed them. I enjoyed the setting, I enjoyed the dark gothic tone. Of course, Koudelka wasn't the best, but it still had that wonderful dark feeling. And I enjoyed the combat system, that Judgment Ring. I enjoyed the HP Lovecraft style monsters. I enjoyed the games. And as I've already mentioned, for me, Covenant, and for a lot of people, was undoubtedly the best game in the series. But the next one was received quite well by critics, but it's not one of my favourites. And in 2005 in Japan, in 2006 in North America, and 2007 in Europe, we got Shadow Hearts from the New World. Developed once more by Nautilus, but this time published in the 3 different regions by 3 different publishers. We had Aruse in Japan, Xseed Games in North America, and Ghostlight in Europe. Now, before I continue talking about From the New World, I have to say that this was not a bad game. In fact, it was a good game, but it seemingly changed the tone of the games that had come before it. While the previous titles had had that gothic feel, this had a kind of colourful and lively approach to the game. While the previous titles had been set mainly in Europe, this one had made its way to the Americas. And during the game, you even visited locations such as New York City and Las Vegas, and the ruins of the Maya civilization. So, while this game does feature in the same reality as Shadow Hearts and Shadow Hearts Covenant, the story is set apart from the rest of the canon. And this led a lot of fans to wonder if this was indeed a sequel or a spin-off. We even got some cameos from those previous games, but as I've mentioned, it just felt detached and then a little bit disjointed from the rest of the series, and I believe that this is what killed it. Now, a lot of people praised the character development and also the narrative, but a number of people cited the level of humour, that humour that had worked so well in Shadow Hearts Covenant, had this time detracted from the experience. Many also felt that it didn't do anything new and the level designs weren't overly enthralling or engaging. Overall, the takeaway from this is that such an exquisite and innovative series had somehow become quite generic and ordinary. Now, as I've said, the scores were great. It stands still to this day at 76 on Metacritic, with many people giving it 7s and 8s. So it's not a bad game. In fact, I still enjoy it, especially if you think of it as something that's not connected to those other games. Now, often when a game in a series such as Dino Crisis 3 changes its settings and its entire feel of the game, it destroys somewhat the franchise. And while this didn't work, I do still feel that it is a great game. But sadly, those sales figures don't lie, and it did not sell very well. Now, this wasn't supposed to be the end of the Shadow Hearts series. In fact, there were plans to make and continue with new titles, however they never came to be. In 2007, just 2 years after Shadow Hearts From the New World arrived in Japan, the company Nautilus was officially dissolved and renamed as Aruse Global Trading. And in 2009, that company was merged fully with Aruse, and Nautilus, or whatever was Nautilus, ceased to be forever. Now, many of those staff, those original staff members of SAC North, eventually became part of a company called Feel Plus, who worked on titles such as Lost Odyssey, which will be another feature of one of these What Happened To videos. So, now we move on to that final part of the video. We've seen what it is, what happened to it, and now we're going to ask, will we see another Shadow Hearts? Will we ever get a remake, a remaster, or even a sequel to Shadow Hearts From the New World? And I am going to say a resounding no. This game is gone. This series is completely gone. I am really sad to say that, because it is such a brilliant series. But now we're just left to look at videos like this and see the trailers and play those PS2 titles, because they are classics and they deserve replaying. But sadly, I don't think we're going to ever see another one. And that's because a lot of the developers and the teams that worked on it have gone their own ways and are now all over the world in different companies working on different projects. Also, as much as I say that this game has a cult following, I'm not sure if there's enough of us out there to voice our demand for this game to come back. But with things like Kickstarter and seeing the success of Eiyuden and the thing that I never thought would come back, that we'd get that spiritual successor to Suikoden, I will hold out a little bit of hope that one day we can see a Shadow Hearts. But I do believe, in my heart of hearts, in my gut, that this game is gone. And on that somber note, it's time for me to say goodbye. Let me know in the comments below which game you would like me to cover next. But for now, this is Roy McCoy, out.